let's talk about a big number for a midsize insurance carrier, $200,000. That's a serious investment. So when you're looking at something like a sophisticated storm model, you got to ask the simple question, is it actually worth it? Can it really deliver a return? Well, we're going to dive in and see if the math on a severe convective storm model really, truly adds up.
Okay, first things first, let's just set the stage with this absolutely jaw-dropping number. Over $100 billion. Yeah, that's billion with a B. According to Gallagher Ray, that's how much insured loss has come from severe convective storms. You know, we're talking hail, tornadoes, those powerful straight-line winds, just in the US and just over the last 2 years. This isn't some small manageable problem anymore. This is a massive industry-shaking threat.
Now, this is where it gets really wild and kind of reframes the whole conversation. Look at this. In the first half of 2024, storms in the U.S. weren't just part of the story. They were the story. They made up 61% of all insured natural catastrophe losses on the entire planet. Let that sink in. That means every other peril, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, floods, all of it, everywhere else in the world, all had to squeeze into that other 39%. So what's the big takeaway here? It's simple, really. We have to stop thinking about these storms as a secondary peril, like there's some kind of sideshow. The data is practically screaming at us that for insurers, SCS is now the main event. And trying to ignore that, well, it's like ignoring the single biggest risk on your books. Okay, so that's the big picture. Now let's bring it down to earth and talk about how this massive threat creates a very real, very tough dilemma for regional carriers. The ones who are often right in the crosshairs when these storms roll through.
Let's make this real. Let's paint a picture of a hypothetical carrier. They're writing about $400 million in property premium, mostly personal and small commercial stuff, across a handful of states known for some pretty nasty weather. They're aiming for a solid profit of, say, 12 to 20 million bucks a year. But here's the kicker. SCCs already makes up a huge chunk, like 20 to 35% of their expected catastrophe losses every single year. And in a bad year, it can get much, much worse.
And that brings us right back to our starting number, $200,000. That's the annual price tag for a top-tier SCS model. Now, for our hypothetical carrier, that's only about 0.05% of their premium, but hey, it's still a big line item on the budget. It absolutely has to justify its existence. So before we even start talking about the return on that investment, we have to ask a more fundamental and maybe a scarier question. In this new world we're living in, what's the real cost of doing nothing? What's the risk of just carrying on as usual? Well, the risk of doing nothing, it shows up in some really painful ways. It's those wild, unpredictable swings in your earnings from one quarter to the next. It's that nagging feeling that you're just throwing money away on reinsurance because you can't really get a handle on your true risk. It's that awful surprise after a hailstorm when you realize you had a massive, underpriced cluster of homes in one single neighborhood. And maybe most importantly, it's the growing pressure from the outside. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This quote from AM Best, a voice that every single carrier pays attention to, says it all. They're explicitly calling out these so-called secondary perils and regional concentrations as major drivers of rating downgrades. For a carrier, that's not just a friendly warning. That's a blinking red light on your dashboard. It's an existential threat. So if doing nothing is clearly not an option, what's the alternative? What's the game plan? Well, let's look at the data-driven defense, the SCS catastrophe model itself, and how this thing actually works. At its heart, an SCS model is not just some fancy weather nap. Think of it more like a flight simulator, but for storms. It runs thousands upon thousands of potential storm seasons, creating events that haven't happened yet but are totally physically plausible. This gives you a much, much richer, forward-looking view of your risk, instead of just staring in the rearview mirror at what's already happened. And just to be clear, this isn't some kind of fringe experimental technology. Using a sophisticated approach like this is right in line with professional best practices, like the ones laid out by the Actuarial Standards Board. This is what modern, responsible risk management looks like today.
Okay, we've laid out the problem, and we've talked about the tool. So now for the good part, the payoff. How in the world does a $200,000 investment generate a real return? We're going to break it down into 3 distinct, super high-impact value streams. These are the 3 pillars of value right here. First, just getting your prices right.
Second, intelligently steering your portfolio to avoid those catastrophic pileups of risk. And third, optimizing how you buy your own protection, your reinsurance. Let's start with pricing, because this is where the numbers get really exciting. For a $400 million carrier, if they can improve their combined ratio by just half a point to a full point, which is totally plausible with better risk data, that translates directly to $2 to $4 million in extra underwriting profit every single year. So how does that even happen? Well, think about it. Before the model, you're kind of flying blind, right? You're probably applying these broad, uniform catastrophe charges over huge areas. But after you have the model, suddenly you have this high-definition map of your risk. You can spot those dense, underpriced clusters and set rates that actually reflect the real risk, right down to the specific zip code or even the type of roof on a house. All right, next up, managing the portfolio. And here, it's not just about the average expected losses, it's about the tail risk. The really extreme, once-in-a-century events that can threaten the whole company. By using the model to steer growth away from the absolute riskiest spots, a carrier can realistically cut its exposure to those nightmare scenarios by 10 to 20%. And this right here, this is what we call the sleep at night value. It's a little harder to stick a precise dollar amount on it, but let me tell you, it is incredibly valuable. It means fewer scary profit warnings, a much lower chance that one bad storm will blow through your entire reinsurance protection, and a much, much better story to tell those rating agencies. And that brings us to our third value stream, reinsurance. When our carrier walks into negotiations armed with robust, credible model output, it's a completely different conversation. They can analyze different coverage structures and show their risk with confidence. A 5 to 10% improvement in the efficiency of, say, a $20 million reinsurance program, that's another $1 to $2 million in value, right there.
So when you just step back and put it all together, the picture becomes crystal clear, doesn't it? You've got this small fixed cost of the model over on one side, and on the other, you have these multiple million-dollar value streams from better pricing and smarter reinsurance. The return on investment isn't just a little bit positive, it's absolutely massive.
This really moves the whole conversation beyond just playing defense. An investment like this isn't just about avoiding losses anymore. It's about building a true strategic, competitive advantage in the marketplace. Frameworks like the Lloyd's Maturity Matrix actually show this journey really well. A carrier goes from a basic foundational level to an advanced one. You're not just passively monitoring risk, you're using sophisticated data to actively steer the ship to inform every single underwriting decision you make. And frankly, this is the kind of journey that regulators and your business partners want to see you on. Ultimately, it all boils down to this one crucial point. It's a fundamental shift in your entire posture, from being reactive, always cleaning up the mess from the last storm, to being proactive and intelligently preparing for the certainty of the next one. Which brings us to our final question, and the one I'll leave you with. In a world where these billion-dollar storm seasons are the new normal, where this kind of severe weather is an absolute certainty, can any carrier, big or small, really afford to just keep guessing?